Reading Ray Brassier's Nominalism, Naturalism, and Materialism, Sellar's Critical Ontology. Foreword. The paper before our consideration was originally titled Nominalism, Naturalism, and Materialism, Sellar's Critical Ontology, which was delivered at the Matter of Contradiction, War Against the Sun conference held at the Mute magazine office in Limehouse Town Hall, London, March 1st to 3rd, 2013. It was later compiled as part of a publication titled Contemporary Philosophical Naturalism and Its Implications by Routledge. Introduction. The allure of nominalism, as Ray Brassier, professor of philosophy at the American University of Beirut, sees it, at its essence, is an appeal to philosophical naturalism, the proposal that reality does not have propositional form, hence an advocacy, whether implicit or explicit, of a critique of a rationalistic tradition which would try and ascribe forms which may be discerned or recognized in reality as constructions, projections, or isolations, etc. Of these, I would include categories such as the ego, the atom, and the nation state, etc. But to be noted is that often the target of an empiricist criticism would begin by not discounting these forms themselves inasmuch as deductions or conclusions that may be drawn from or more specifically about them. The philosophical task then for Ray Brassier becomes one of recognizing how propositionally structured thought arises within nature and how it may be used to track natural processes despite the lack of congruence between propositional form and natural order. Indeed, this is the challenge, he says, Wilfrid Zellers rose to in trying to explain what it might mean to be a post-Darwinian naturalist. Brassier, 2014. In his paper, he seeks to exemplify how Sellars attacks what he refers to as the myth of the given, i.e., the belief that the knowledge of what we perceive is independent of our conceptual apparatus. This position is attacked to disqualify a transcendent idealism, if only to make room for a transcendent realism. To begin with, I would say that we can find evidence for Sellars' commitment to a rationalistic emphasis by his stressing in naturalism and ontology, for example, that propositional form belongs only in linguistic and conceptual orders, seemingly allowing an entry into the analytic tradition's investigation into ordinary language philosophy, while also quoting the problem of inherence, which naturalists eventually seem to face up to. Aims. The paper claims to demonstrate how this emphasis on the inherence of propositional form only in linguistic and conceptual orders follows from his rejection of the myth of the given. To repeat, the paper claims to demonstrate how this emphasis on the inherence of propositional form only in linguistic and conceptual orders follows from his rejection of the myth of the given. It would seek to situate what it identifies as Sellars' naturalistic commitments within the problematic of a post-Kantian critical ontology, while also bringing forth how his critique of the given brings forth his commitment to nominalism. Along the way, it would attempt to appraise his functional role account of meaning and end by presenting his conception of the relation between language and reality in what is referred to as a methodological materialism. Critical ontology. To begin with, the problem of critical ontology is presented as that of trying to answer the question, what is there, in which it is insufficient to merely present an inventory of names or objects, as this inadequately answers the Kantian clause of how do we know them. Sellars accepts these premises, yet maintains that nomination remains central, if not seminal, to the linguistic enterprise, but with the caveat that nomination here does not refer to transcendental essences, such as Plato's forms, for instance, or to meaning as such, but to material processes. Along this path of attempting to answer what is there, we inevitably run into the question of what is a category, or as Brassier puts it, what kinds are. The basic question about these is whether they are mind-independent attributes of one or several substances, or whether they are mind-dependent concepts. And you will find that this line of reasoning does much to recapitulate the history of philosophy, ranging from the British empiricists such as Berkeley, Locke, and Hume, who sought to classify properties of objects such as color or sonority, and the continental intervention in the guise of Kant presenting transcendental categories or concepts which we would have to presume that allow us to classify other objects in relation to each other, such as time and space, for example. Sellars' argument here is that categories are neither, in the sense that they are neither transcendental concepts, nor are they mind-independent attributes. Rather, they are metalinguistic functions that are nonetheless a mode of representing reality, and such a description would lead me to ask whether this would mean that they are cognitive precepts. Here, we would be well led by Brassier's initial introduction of them as kinds, for to specify a category determines aspects as they relate of an entity. Representations, however, as these categories may yet be, are not conceptual relations, or relations between concepts and things. This insistence is what sets Sellars apart from traditional accounts of representation. Categories, we are told, are not representative of any given feature of the world, and as such are not metonymic. It is this insight which leads Brassier to read Sellars as materialist in a methodological rather than a metaphysical sense. It is also the mark where we may draw a distinction between Zizek's approach of attempting to trace a homology between a family and the species, and the apparently non-conceptual use of representations depicted here, in the sense that they are not metonymic. Myth of the given. What is the myth of the given itself, however? 1. A confusing of thinking with sensing. Brassier puts it in the form of a triad of propositions which explicates this. A. X senses red sense content S entails X knows non-inferentially that S is red. B. The ability to sense sense content is unacquired. C. The ability to know facts of the form X is phi is acquired. A recapitulation of Sellars' argument is offered. Knowledge pertains to facts, which themselves have propositional form. But how do we know a fact, i.e., are they sensed or deduced? To put it in Brassier's terms, either the capacity to sense facts is acquired or it is unacquired. Were we to say that the capacity to sense facts is unacquired, we would have to conclude that it is a matter of direct perception. Were we to say that the capacity to sense facts is acquired, it would mean that it is a question of conceptual recognition and deduction. There is much of this which I am sure you may see is common to what is at stake in debates between whether nurture or nature is the predominant principle. Simply put, sensing is not knowing. Summating, this may be a question about whether facts constitute a sensible or an intelligible order, with Brassier batting for the latter. A point where Brassier's inquiry does intersect with that of Zizek in terms of its scope is when he posits that were the ability to sense facts be unacquired, then it would not be explainable via the process of natural selection, which at the very least would entail the acquisition of a mate, arguably chosen for reasons of their traits or capacities. The background operating in much of this thinking is that nature constitutes a sensible order, whereas the mind or understanding is what constitutes the intelligible order, which would be consistent with much of rationalistic thinking. Indeed, this is emphasized by Brassier's emphasis on the conceptual deployment being rule-governed. Let me repeat, indeed this is emphasized by Brassier's emphasis on conceptual deployment being rule-governed activity and not a matter of sensation, a precept which Sellars himself takes up after Kant. Regarding the argument of the myth of the given, Sellars, for his part, disagrees with premise A. Simply put, hearing a neighbor whisper a curse or seeing that blood is red are not non-inferential perceptions. They are conceptually mediated and not simply intuited. In a footnote, we are informed that this is not an effort by Sellars to discredit intuition per se, but rather to foreground how much of intuitive knowledge operates against the background of non-intuitive conceptual knowledge. There is, however, an implicit critique of the idea of knowledge as disclosure, for this does posit that intuitive knowledge itself is made possible via a conceptual apparatus which is publicly observable in time and space. The myth of the given, hence presented in these terms, brings to our notice the apparent confusion between intuitions and concepts, leading to what Brassier describes as the myth of the categorical given, the confusion between intuitions and concepts, where the world impresses itself upon the mind like a seal upon wax. Brassier deems this to be the confusion of sensing with sensing as. This is what Sellars referred to as the manifest image, which is a product of our collective cultural evolution, an important term in his work, as it represents our normative modes in perhaps a Heideggerian thrown in the world sense, and is to be contrasted with the scientific image, which in going beyond the former term dares to posit new concepts of basic objects via theoretical speculation. And today I find myself compelled to add that these objects may indeed be relations. Yet what is entailed in terms of the relation between thinking and reality is worth recapitulating. In Brassier's own words, sensing is of the real, but cannot be about it. Thinking is about the real, but cannot enter into direct contact with it. Mark these words, for we will return to this interface later. It is important to notice, at least from my perspective, how the argument regarding the distinction between intuitions and concepts can save us from many a premature subsumption in our arguments. And by subsumptions here, I do mean the Marxian subsumption of the working day, for example, into a capitalist instrument geared to the production of surplus value. But also other kinds of narratorial subsumptions, such as the obfuscation of a minority's narrative of themselves by, say, a national, religious, or ethnic majority. How would this work? As Brassier points out, to be aware that a given precept has the categorical ascription of F is not to sense it as F, whereas this short-circuiting, as it were, is precisely the kind of uncritical tendency that the myth of the given has us overlook, confusing of sensing with sensing as. What is entailed here may indeed be an implicit constructivism, for as we have pointed out, to sense something as F is to deploy the concept of F, a kind of reasoning which readers of Badiou, for instance, may recognize as properly Platonic. The situation of thought, perhaps not as much as a consequence but rather a kind of dawning, is the realization that the mind is not a private inner sanctum, a metaphoric much deployed in the work of certain classical rationalists, like Descartes, for example. A position that Sellars does not entirely step away from, perhaps because it is such an architectonic that allows for the epistemic considerations that may not have otherwise been feasible. The mind is rather externalized by our linguistic activity, even if this externalization is operational in what we recognize as our own silent thought events. This working hypothesis also would entail its obverse correlate that our ability to cognize and comprehend our own thoughts is acquired rather than innate. A radicalization of Descartes, as it were, even as it seemingly steps away from his method. The other aspect of this emphasis is a corollary of what has just been stated, i.e., given the contingency of our minds on their externalization in linguistic practices, we may say that speaking is prior to thinking in the order of knowing, yet this would remain compatible with the claim that thinking is prior to speaking in the order of being. These twin propositions make room for what is acknowledged to be a reality of pre- or non-verbal thought, just as they emphasize that to even perceive our thoughts as such is a function of our linguistic social mediation. Having established the mutual social embeddedness of thought and linguistic activity, such a conception significantly does not reduce one to the other. Apart from the readily observable subscription to the myth of the given that has been explicated in both rationalistic and empiricist currents, phenomenology, too, in its ascription to a search for an originary intentionality that may have been guiding an act, bestowing upon it meaning as it were, is insufficiently appreciative of the socially mediated aspect of our own meaningful activities, and as they are recognized by us. Though here the qualification should be added that the strand in question may be in reference to the eidetic reduction, which itself would recognize that intentionality is often, if not always, a linguistic act. Consequences and departure. The version of nominalism we are presented with of Sellars is metalinguistic, in the sense that while it acknowledges the arbitrariness of the relation of any given signifier to its signified content, let us say the color red, which the words both red and rouge do in English and French respectively, It would nevertheless recognize these significations as functions that signify or perhaps enunciate the specificity of the sense content in question, even if the name and the language in which it is done is arbitrary. In the terms of the paper, the mentioned sign design plays the same linguistic role in French as it does in English. Even, I might add, if the sense content is perceived in distinct objects or via other apparatuses. This understanding, as it were, allows for us to demarcate properties without an appeal to a Platonic realm of essences, or by invoking the thinghood of an object by emphasizing the function in question when we say that red is rouge or a triangle is triangular, by conceiving this bequeathal as a distributive singular function, much the same as one which says lions are tawny, meaning that each lion of that color is of that color, rather than as some Platonists and even schools in Indian philosophy put it, that lions participate in the quality of tawniness. This may resemble something of Aristotle's initial critique of Plato. This does entail the recognition, however, that what is actually being fashioned in such ascriptions are what Brassier refers to as tokenings, rather than a form of substitutable reference of linguistic categories to abstract extra-linguistic entities. In other words, this is a nominalism that is veering towards the substantive and away from any idealism, or indeed, I might add, away from a sense of its addressal to an other, understood to be another constituting logic or interpretation. Taken in its import, what this would entail is that this is a nominalism which is metalinguistic in the sense that it appears to term what we once commonly called names as functions, thereby bequeathing to them the possibility of being personal denominators, rather than as commonly understood fare. Here, we seem to be edging closer towards what Wittgenstein once denied, i.e., a private language. That is, if this tokening were to be read in any metonymic sense, as I might add that the notion of participation in qualities often does via its invocation of abstract essences. To repeat, we seem to be edging closer towards what Wittgenstein once denied, a private language. That is, if this tokening were to be read in any metonymic sense, in the sense of it standing in for something else, like a quality. Brassier does, however, add the caveat by asserting that these tokenings, rather than asserting a compendium for a subject, may indeed be particular instantiations of their use that themselves are singular and contextual, perhaps not unlike signatures. Further, Brassier does in fact note that Sellars does have a more explicit critique of Wittgenstein. If for the latter, the world consisted of facts and not things, Sellar's materialism would lead him to assert that the world in fact does not consist of facts, but of objects, which may, however, be represented by linguistic sign designs, tokens, etc. In returning to his textual example, we are reassured that when a non-linguistic entity is designated to be red, we are not saying that it stands in for red. Rather, red is a designation which is ascribed to the entity. The position that is advanced here and purported to Sellars is one which thinks, quote, conceptual functions as linguistically incarnated in sign designs whose material characteristics picture objects, end of quote. I would add that this appeal to écriture, however, veers dangerously close to conflating legibility with hieroglyphics. Yet this is the operation which semantic functions are purported to rest upon, with the exception, however, that picturing itself is not a semantic function. As we have already established earlier, how Sellar's rejection of the myth of the given is not his endorsement of linguistic idealism or the further developed claim that reality is a linguistic construct. His is a naturalism, rather, which acknowledges language to be embedded in non-linguistic reality, devoid of propositional form. Raymond Brassier does appear to offer what may be a subtle criticism of Sellar's when he states that to be a materialist is to refuse to organicize nature, that is, to see nature via any anthropomorphic principle. Natural linguistic objects which are cited, such as sounds, spaces, marks, and movements, are then some kind of base desiderata that depict parts of reality. The qualification that seems to be operating here is that names form part of the natural order only insofar as they are meaningless. The naturalism operating here would lead Brassier to say that insofar as reference is not a semantic thesis, representation is not an epistemic thesis or epistemic proposition. Both of these are relegated to natural functions. A distinction is made between propositional and conceptual form, with the former being found in the natural order, according to the paper, even among animals. Brassier does state that syntactical form is realized in the neurobiological properties of nervous systems, by which we may hypothesize that the sensory apparatus of our organs, for example, may embody how bodies themselves are attenuated to pick up certain stimuli that itself registers itself to us in propositional, if not syntactical order. That is, in the form of some S is P, etc. To use the terms of the paper earlier, sum of sense content X may be S. And you could say that sense content X is red or so on. Yet this would appear to go against Sellar's own insistence on the distinction between sensory and syntactical or propositional perception, or rather, at least posit the site where we may have to agree to some sort of meeting. Raymond Brassier goes further by asserting that propositional form is pre-linguistic. In remaining for the moment within the Sellarian paradigm, however, we appear to be left with a kind of parallelism between propositional linguistic realm on the one hand, between the propositional linguistic realm on the one hand, and the natural world on the other, where the meaning of words designates not a relation between words and things, but relations between words. And on the other hand, the relation between words and things is rather a function of the practices of a community of speakers and writers of that language. To sum up in the author's own terms, categories can be explained in terms of their metalinguistic role, itself explainable in terms of correct representation, which in turn is explainable in terms of picturing, and how adequate a representation this may be. The role of philosophy. Wilfrid Sellars thus is a thinker who, having acknowledged the insight of empirical reasoning, avoids its regresses by retaining for philosophy a position which legislates on categorical revisions. That may have to be made in the light of a changing picture of our understanding of the natural world. While empirical findings will always guide an enterprise, the direction of investigation remains irreducible to a mere empirical fact, hence subject to a critical ontology that takes cognizance of how its questions and findings arose in the first place, a procedure indissolubly bound to method. Brassier indeed holds fast to what appears to be a physicalism that he endorses that may appear at counter-currents with the depiction of Sellar's offered. At least from my point of view, in his concluding remarks, that it remains for philosophy to anatomize both manifest and scientific images, which here appear to be his operating metaphor for how propositional form makes itself apparent to us, consequently lending itself to logical, meta-representational, and finally conceptual form. Thank you.